Hey everybody, welcome back to This Week in Global Development. I'm Raj Kumar, I'm the President and Editor-in-Chief here at DevX, and this is our weekly podcast where we talk about all the big headlines in development. This week, in this episode, we're digging into a really critical question, which is relevant for the moment, I think. It's how do you lead as a leader? How do you lead on economic growth given everything going on? Geopolitical tensions, environmental challenges, rapid technological change. And particularly, where do businesses fit into all of this? And we're thinking about big businesses and small ones. How do they drive opportunity for everybody, not just for a few? And what kind of leadership is needed now to make that a reality? Those are obviously some big questions, but they're questions we explored with the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. They're the sponsor of this special episode. And they are, I think, as many listening know, a private sector engine for economic growth as part of Mastercard. Last month, I had the privilege of being in DC. I think some of you listening did too, with the Mastercard team for the Global Inclusive Growth Summit. It's an annual event, a real highlight on the calendar here in DC. It brought about 400 practitioners together from across sectors, and we were exploring exactly those questions. How do you build a more resilient, inclusive economy? And what does it mean to be a leader in this time to try to do that? So the event happened. It was a big success, and we want to talk about it. And I'm joined by Jonathan Fantini-Porter, who is the Senior Vice President for Social Impact for the Americas at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. A lot of you probably know Jonathan. You may know him because he just left his role as Executive Director at the Partnership for Central America, which kind of did a lot of exactly what we're going to be talking about today. He led the implementation of an economic development strategy. It mobilized more than $5 billion in foreign direct investments and social programs in the Central American region, supporting 20 million families, 100 businesses. So he knows this space really well. It's great to be with you, John.
Thanks so much, and thanks for that kind introduction. You know I'm a reader, a longtime user of DevX products, so I'm grateful to be with you today. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's really good to see you. Maybe we just start out with the event. You were there. I know you just started at the center when the Global Inclusive Growth Summit happened, but you've been a regular. You've been coming to these events over the years as we host them annually with the center. And I guess I want to get your take overall on what was it like for you this year?
Sure, yeah. Look, I think the summit to me was incredibly energizing. And it wasn't just because of the caliber of the people that were in the room, but I think also the clarity of purpose right across sectors. A few things that stood out to me. I think the key is the shared urgency around how do we future-proof inclusive growth in a lot of ways. As we're going through this in many ways substantive realignment of an order that we know, and that is happening live, and we're being present for that. So we're seeing explosive growth in the middle class, rapid urbanization of populations. We're observing digitization and automation from AI to blockchain to 5G networking, the energy transition for the first time in nearly half a generation. So it's an incredibly volatile time in so many ways. And in that context, there was really one or two key takeaways that stood out for me from the summit. And that's the importance of cross-sector collaboration at scale. You had representation from the private sector, from the public sector, from the social sector, policymakers to tech innovators to community finance leaders. And we saw that siloed solutions just aren't enough in this context that we're living through at this point. So the summit, for me, really reinforced that the real impact comes when we put insights to work together. That's across financial institutions, that's across small businesses and small business resilience and growth, inclusive innovation, by bridging corporate innovation with public sector missions and local and civil society community knowledge. And we heard this in a number of the sessions as well, I think, right? So we heard Michael Miebach, the CEO of Mastercard, speaking about the need to collaborate with trust and really saying that private and public sector alone will not be able to solve when we're dealing with cyber attacks and the question of cybersecurity. We heard from Dr. James Mwangi of Equity Bank, who talked about the work Mastercard is doing on the MADE Alliance to create access to the digital economy for individuals across the African continent. And of course, we launched Mastercard Strive in the Kingdom of Bahrain to drive a more robust private sector in that country. So I think in all, the summit to me really underscored this urgency of inclusive growth as a social and business imperative. And we saw at the macro level, rural and other undercapitalized communities globally having incredible capacities, but opportunities not always equally present. And so how do we integrate those under-digitized, those under-capitalized, those under-skilled communities and small businesses into this fast-moving global economy so that this exponential technological high tide in so many ways actually raises all boats. So that's takeaways.
I love that. And I got that from a lot of the participants too, who felt like, look, this week, this was during the World Bank and IMF spring meetings here in DC, and it was a moment of such uncertainty. And I got people saying, I didn't expect to come away from an event like this inspired, because it seems like most of the headlines are not good. And yet, when we got to hear from some of the, particularly the social innovators, some of the smaller businesses, for me, some of the companies I'd never heard of, but that are doing things like around remittances or lowering the cost of getting into business and doing business as a smaller company. A lot of those things sounded pretty inspiring, because you realize there's a lot of activity that still is going to happen. And there's a lot of geographies where people are moving ahead, kind of regardless of what happens in Washington or in Brussels or in London. And that was a good thing to hear. And I get your point too, that a lot of the action is at the intersection. So you mentioned Michael Nieback, the CEO of Mastercard. He was on stage with the head of Interpol. It's a very kind of unlikely combination, but here you've got a company that's very focused on securing information, user data, really great knowledge of digital security. And then you've got essentially like the world's largest police force coordinating mechanism, talking about the reality of cybercrime, transnational crime, et cetera. How do you get at that? So I agree. A lot of the magic was at the intersection, and we had a lot of those intersections on stage. Maybe just on this point of what those two were talking about, Nieback and Valdesi from Interpol, what do you think about the themes that came out of the session on cyber threats, in particular on AI, a lot of the tech themes that came out? What was your takeaway from all of that conversation?
Yeah, I think it's representative, probably a bigger question when you're dealing with leadership at this time, and that is how you're managing this incredibly volatile and quickly changing time. I spent a large portion of my career in national security at the White House, Homeland Security, our national security committees in Congress. And one framework that was often used was VUCA, right? And so VUCA was created by a group at the U.S. Army War College as a way to sort of manage and understand the increasingly volatile moments in reality that we faced. VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And so in that world of VUCA, where the challenges we face are moving with such unprecedented speed and interconnectedness, I think in a lot of ways, decisiveness in that environment, and we heard this in that panel and others, decisiveness in that style of leadership in this rapidly advancing technological time, it just isn't enough. You've got to be able to hold effectively multiple realities at the same time. You've got to be able to manage a both-and approach to this volatility, to this uncertainty, to the complexity and ambiguity of this world, so that really a decade ago, you might focus on one issue, let's say, in relative isolation. Today, issues are intertwined. AI deployment, cybersecurity threats, to your point, global inflation, trust in institutions, they're all interconnected. And so in business, I'd say what this means really is it's holding both short-term agility with long-term strategy in your hands at once. And leaders have to effectively be able to be both technically skilled, to your point, whether it's in AI, whether we're talking about blockchain, whether we're talking about broader networking. So that technical skill, but at the same time, deeply human-centered and able to kind of go back and forth from being on the court and in that game to then being able to step back into the bleachers and watching the game from a distance to be able to zoom out to the big picture, I'd say. So it really, in so many ways, leadership today, strength in leadership is about that fluency in the digital transformation. And that's not just using the tools, but it's understanding how these tools are reshaping power and access. And then it's clarity of a real moral compass, right? So understanding that the consequences of exclusion in a highly technologically fast-paced environment are steep. And then third is really that collaborative muscle. So when you're talking about the speed of this technological advancements, when we're talking about cyber, the collaboration muscle is key. I'd say this isn't an era for heroes. It's an era for coalitions. And in so many ways, our center is helping create these coalitions, from fintech partnerships to AI skilling programs for workers. That's the kind of leadership I think that this moment demands when we're dealing with some of the technological advancements that you just pointed to.
Yeah, I love the way you're putting this because if you imagine the archetypical CEO, you imagine this really tough person who's going to just make a decision and drive the organization in one direction. And what you're saying, and I agree, what came out of a lot of these sessions is, you know what, that can lead to making some pretty big mistakes because this is a moment when we don't really know, you don't have enough information to be that decisive and that bold. And you want that boldness when it comes to kind of your moral compass, your principles as an organization. But in terms of your operational decisions, the facts on the ground are changing really fast.
Yeah.
So if you make that kind of big, bold bet with a big institution, like you might bet wrong, And so we almost need to change the model we have of what is a great CEO or a great leader today. It's a lot more of the listening. You talk about the bleachers, right? It's a lot more absorbing from your own institution, from people on the front lines. Like, what are they hearing? What are your customers saying? What are the real challenges in different markets? And being adaptable enough so that when you do finally make that, tough decision and a bold decision, but it's based on more than just your gut, because your gut can really be wrong today if the inputs are changing this fast, right? I think it's a very tough time to be a leader.
I think you're right. And we see it in so many of the challenges that folks are facing from the public sector to private sector. This volatility, the uncertainty of this moment is real. And the question is going to be how quickly can you, to your point, how quickly can you adapt and how quickly can you skill up to the skills that are required for this unprecedented moment that we're in?
Yeah. And I think looking to where there are assets, like, in other words, you could easily look at the situation today and say, okay, the headlines are bad. There's a lot of uncertainty. We have fewer resources than we ever had. But if you reframe it and you think, well, when we want to make an impact in the world, we want to have an inclusive economy. It's not just official institutions. Businesses play a huge role here. And if you reframe it, include them in the conversation, potentially it's actually a much bigger sector than before. And I think that's a lot of what we heard from business leaders who were on stage and a lot of social entrepreneurs that are on stage who might be running a tech company, but they see themselves as someone trying to drive a social impact in the world. And that was exciting to hear. We heard from impact investors and others. So maybe I get your take on this question of where does business fit in? For a long time, I feel like it's been in its own silo. And at least what we were trying to do with this event is break that silo down.
It's such a key question, right? When we're talking about this interconnected world that we're in right now, you can't see solutions as being a public sector or government solution or a private sector or a business solution. It's what's the holistic solution to a holistic challenge? Full stop on that. And so I spend a lot of my career, as you mentioned, in national security, and whether we're working on cyber or transnational terrorism, when you're dealing with these nonlinear threats that cross borders of time and space, it's not enough for one sector to act alone. It really has to be an all-hands-on effort. And this is true for the largest corporations through the smallest businesses. In fact, I think we know it well, right? Most of the world's small businesses are the backbone of economies and communities. You look to the data, it's about 90% of businesses are small businesses. In the US, that number is about 99%. So it's an incredible point of scale and scope that small businesses in particular have on our communities. And the question then really becomes, how are small businesses going to succeed so that communities succeed and that the broader economic growth and opportunity that we hope for happens? And that's a big part of what we're doing at Mastercard. You mentioned that I'm a recent joiner of Mastercard and the Mastercard team at the Center for Inclusive Growth. And what we really believe is that we can help create that ecosystem that supports these small businesses. So let me just offer one example of that, and that is the Mastercard Strive program that's been a program launched by the center that's been running for a number of years now. And really what it focuses on is addressing the key pain points that we've learned from the research that we've done, listening to small business leaders, and that is really access to capital, its digital tools, and its know-how, right? Having those three things, digital, capital, and know-how, is our key to overcoming some of the barriers to growth for small businesses. We are particularly focused right now on a number of undercapitalized regions and where we see the biggest opportunity for growth. And you take, for example, rural communities in the United States. We're partnered with a number of organizations, including Rural Local Initiatives Support Corporation, which is one of the biggest community development financial institutions in the country, We're partnered with Heartland Forward, which is working to drive economic success across 20 states of the American heartland. And through partners like these, and to your point of coalition building, it's through partnerships like these that I think we can bring a scaled level of approach. I just got back from Bentonville, Arkansas a couple days ago, and I spent some time down there with Heartland Forward, their CEO, Ross Duvall, who was at the summit and spoke with I was there with the founder of Heartland Forward, Jim Walton, and other leaders that are really focused on driving economic growth in the American heartland. And what is just abundantly evident when you're spending time in our rural communities is that small and local businesses are that economic backbone. But they're more than that, I think, really. They're often the social infrastructure. They employ local talent. They keep dollars circulating locally. They create shared identities. So what we've seen is that through partnerships like the one with Heartland Forward, rural entrepreneurs, when given the opportunity to infrastructure and capital access and tailored digital tools, it's not a question of a lacking of ingenuity. It's often a gap in their access to those core infrastructure tools for opportunity. And so that's what we're doing in a lot of ways at the center and with Mastercard and with Mastercard's Strive USA initiative, supporting programs that help entrepreneurs in rural communities digitize those operations, access those alternative financing tools, and skill up. Because to your point, Raj, businesses, even the most micro businesses, are key to inclusive growth. But to activate that potential, you've got to invest in their digital access, their capital, and their skills really to help them thrive in this this connected economy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Big corporations obviously get most of the attention, but as you say, micro ones, even like a one-person company,
Yeah.
if they add another employee, they've just doubled their workforce, right? And that's where really the growth opportunity in employment comes from. If you look at the statistics, it's basically small businesses. That's the opportunity. And what's happening in the US is really mirrored to what's happening around the world, which the world economy is growing. There's lots of great, exciting growth. And in the US, the economy's been gangbusters now for a couple of decades. It's gone through the roof, but it's not equally distributed. And rural parts of the country have really fared the worst and faced the brunt of that. And so you could look at that as a bad news story, and in many ways it is, but it's also a huge opportunity. If you can tap into the digital tools that are available now, if you can bring a lot of those businesses up to speed, they have the chance to grow. And a little bit of growth there, that little mom and pop business adding an employee or two, that's a huge difference potentially in parts of the country that have been falling behind. So yeah, I think it's in a lot of ways that panel I remember, it gives you a little bit of a playbook. Like, here's what we can do. Here's what small businesses can do. But here's also what people thinking about driving economic growth can do and where they can focus. And there is a lot of opportunity in rich countries and poor ones to do this kind of work. I just wonder if you could reflect for a second, just given your background with the Partnership for Central America, there is all this money on the sidelines. There's been incredible growth, right? We're talking about trillions of dollars in pension funds and money market funds. And yet there's all this need in rural America, in low and middle income countries around the world. How do you see the opportunity to get more of the money that's out there invested in the places that need it? What are some of those opportunities for financial investment for economic growth?
Yeah, it's a timely question, and there's a moment for the private sector and multilateral development banks to come together with national governments and others to identify where the greatest need is and what the vehicles are to do it. From the partnership, you mentioned we mobilized $5.2 billion for indirect investments through a blended financing model, and that in these efforts, as well as similar efforts in government from that perspective, I'd say that impact capital, it doesn't move because of intention. It moves because of confidence in the partners, in the projects, in the depth of analysis, in the operating model of the vehicle that's being shaped to deploy that. And it's the confidence in that structural components of financial mobilization, of economic growth, of economic development efforts like that determine in a lot of ways the success and the ability to attract the capital that's necessary for that. And I'd say, sort of breaking that down into practical lessons learned from the partnership and others, it's a theory of change that really grounds the program or projects on data and insights so that you're sure that your vision is based on facts that can scale. And so the problem and the theory of change are grounded in facts. I'd say structured and trusted anchor partnerships that are aligned around a common strategy, and often best when that common strategy is going with the winds in the direction of where things are headed. And then a delivery model that really points to scalability. And so what is the method in the market that you're working in that ensures that you're not talking about a limited path to growth, but then applying sort of a private sector perspective that your total available market is being viewed in the maximum way for impact. And so I'd say those three things are those three approaches of a theory of change based on facts, anchor partnerships that are trusted and aligned around a common strategy, and then a delivery model that really points towards scalability are three of the success factors that we've seen in some of these efforts that really have taken off.
Yeah, that resonates with me, and particularly the third one, because I feel like a lot of people do get partners, they've got a theory of change, and they get a pilot going. They get a very small scale investment going. But the reason the trillions are still on the sidelines is because they haven't figured a way to make that little pilot, that small, successful even investment, turn into something that's big enough that you could get the really powerful financial players in the game. They're looking at these markets, whether it's domestic in the US or whether it's overseas, and saying, well, how do I deploy much larger amounts of capital? And if some of the development finance institutions working in partnerships with groups like the Mastercard Center, if these groups can come together and show, hey, here's an opportunity, here's an operating model, the right partners are there, and the addressable market is massive. It's at the scale of countries. That's when you could start to deploy a lot of this capital. And then ultimately it has to get to exactly the small businesses we're talking about. I mean, ultimately that's how you drive the growth, that you build these investment cases that get money to the hands of entrepreneurs and small businesses on the ground that are doing things. So on that point, maybe we can wrap up with the fact that this is U.S. National Small Business Month.
Yeah.
It's obviously a big area of focus for the Global Inclusive Growth Summit and for the center at Mastercard where you work. So let's just talk a little bit more about them. What advice might you have for small businesses given this month, this recognition month that's happening now? We hear a lot about big businesses, big CEOs on stage at big events talking about their challenges. What about small business leaders? What could they do now with all the uncertainty that's happening?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. And it's great because it's not abstract. The answer is not abstract. It's a practical answer, right? We know small businesses are the engine to economic prosperity. We get that. We know that. And yet we're seeing firsthand how at this moment they are under more pressure than ever from all of the factors that we just laid out. So with all the humility due to leaders of small businesses that are driving these engines of our economy every single day on the ground, building the entrepreneurial spirit that is reflective of countries throughout the world, I'd say first digitize core operations, right? Whether it's inventory, marketing, payment systems, even basic tech tools can dramatically improve resilience and market access, and that points to growth. So I'd say that's sort of the first point there, the digitization equation. The second is really around leaning into partnerships. You do not have to do this alone. You can tap into the local chambers, community lenders, digital service providers who can help you grow to smarter levels, safer levels when you think about cyber, and higher levels. At Mastercard, pointing to one of our efforts, Strive USA, the program is really designed to help these small businesses do just that. And we are especially, I think, thinking about where we see small businesses in overlooked areas, regions, sectors by traditional systems. So if I'd sum it up, I'd say this Small Business Month, the message from us is simple. We see you, we're with you, and we're investing in your future,
Yeah, I love that message. And you're making me think of a friend of mine who runs a small business here in the United States in a rural area. And he joined an association of other small businesses. And one of the things he picked up from other small business owners was the importance of digitization. And he went and did some of that work to digitize his operations, which was a pain in the neck. It was hard. It took some effort and some investment. But at the end of it, his company has done a lot better, and he feels like it's just much more resilient now. He can grow, he can move and change his strategy, and he can do it all because a lot of what would have held him back in the past was that he wasn't digital.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. It's bigger companies have the wherewithal to do this. They've done it already. They're well on the path to digital transformation. A lot of smaller companies are not there yet, and these opportunities are getting cheaper for them. getting easier, more user-friendly, and can really transform their companies. And as you say, in a time of cyber threat, they're at risk too. That's one of the takeaways I had from the cyber threat sessions at the Global Inclusive Growth Summit was we think of cybersecurity as someone else's problem. Like you're going to outsource this to a company or Interpol, or some law enforcement agency. They're going to deal with it. And the truth is it's everybody's now because it's that ubiquitous.
That's it. Yeah. And you think about the impact to a small business from a major cyber attack, that can put a small business out, right? And so how you build in the resilience, how you build in the security systems, and that comes with training, comes, of course, with the right digital footprints up front, but getting to that place where you're strong and safe at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, among the many highlights we had at this session, we had a number of corporate CEOs there, lots of leaders. And so I think between the technical advice we got, between the inspirational, leadership messages we got from many leaders who were there, just hearing from her about what's possible and what kind of drives all of us with a sense of purpose was really impactful. And it was a breath of fresh air. I think that the whole event, the Global Inclusive Growth Summit, was a real breath of fresh air that was well needed and utilized by the several hundred people who were there. So it was good to see you there, and it's really good to have you here to talk about it. Thanks, Jonathan.
Raj, thanks so much for the time. Thank you for doing everything you do and for sharing the message that you do. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks, everybody.